Somebody in your family was told to stop cooking with lard. Somebody was told the sofrito was too heavy, the morcilla was unsafe, and the crispy rice stuck to the bottom of the pot was burnt food that should be thrown away. Number 19 on this list was banned in more than 20 states. The science on number 15 was wrong for 40 years, and the people who said so are finally admitting it. And number 6 was confiscated by building inspectors who called it a fire hazard. These were not mistakes. These were techniques that worked for centuries before anyone in a lab coat thought to test them. So hit subscribe and stay right here, because here are 25 banned Puerto Rican cooking tricks that scientists now say were genius. Number 25. Rendering your own manteca. For decades, Puerto Rican families in East Harlem and the South Bronx rendered their own pork fat at home, pouring it through cloth into old coffee cans and storing it on the counter. Mainland nutritionists called it a heart attack in a jar. School lunch programs banned it. The USDA dietary guidelines listed animal fat as a primary risk factor for heart disease, and federal nutrition assistance programs refused to cover lard. Margarine and vegetable shortening were pushed as the modern, safer alternative, but the fat profile of properly rendered lard is closer to olive oil than it is to butter. It is lower in saturated fat than the hydrogenated oils that replaced it, and it contains none of the trans fats that those replacements turned out to carry. The kitchens that never stopped using manteca were not behind. They were ahead of a correction that took the rest of the country half a century to make. Number 24. Smoking fish on the fire escape railing. In apartment buildings across the South Bronx and East Harlem, Puerto Rican families hung salted fish from the fire escape railings and let the open air do what a commercial smokehouse would charge money for. They split the fish, packed it in coarse salt overnight, rinsed it, and draped it over the iron bars where the sun and wind could pull the moisture out over 2 or 3 days. Some rigged a small charcoal tray underneath for a low smoke that flavored the flesh and kept the flies off. Fire marshals and housing inspectors treated it as a code violation. Open flame on a fire escape was a citation. Hanging food outside a window was a health department complaint. Landlords posted notices. The city called it unsanitary. But the combination of salt, smoke, and airflow created conditions where bacteria could not survive. The finished product lasted for weeks without refrigeration, which mattered in buildings where the icebox was shared between 3 families and the electricity cut out every summer. The women who did this were not guessing. They were applying a preservation method older than the city that was trying to stop them. Number 23. Coloring food with achiote oil. The bright orange hue of Puerto Rican rice, stews, and beans comes from annatto seeds steeped in hot oil until they release their pigment. Mainland food regulators treated it with suspicion. The FDA restricted annatto as a color additive in commercially processed foods, and school kitchens serving Puerto Rican neighborhoods in New York and Chicago were told to stop coloring the rice. It looked unnatural. It looked like it had been dyed. And it had been, with a seed that contains antioxidants, including tocotrienols, a form of vitamin E that researchers now connect to improved cholesterol markers and reduced inflammation. Indigenous Caribbean cooks had been using annatto for centuries before the Spanish arrived. The orange was never decoration. It was nutrition the schools were scraping off the plate. Number 22. Burning the bottom of the rice on purpose. Every Puerto Rican who grew up eating rice from a caldero knows the pegao. That golden, crunchy layer stuck to the bottom of the pot that everyone in the family fights over. Cooking instructors on the mainland called it burnt rice. School lunch programs threw it away, and USDA guidelines on acrylamide, the compound formed when starchy foods are browned at high heat, gave nutrition boards another reason to classify the crispy bottom as a health risk. But the Maillard reaction that creates pegao generates new aromatic compounds that do not exist in normally cooked rice, and the texture shift between soft grains and the crisp bottom layer activates different regions of the palate in the same bite. The families who scraped the caldero clean were not salvaging a mistake. They were engineering a second texture into a one-pot staple. Number 21. Crushing garlic in a wooden pylon instead of cutting it. The heavy wooden mortar and pestle sat on the counter of nearly every Puerto Rican kitchen in the Bronx, in Humboldt Park, in Santurce. Commercial kitchen codes banned porous wood tools. Health inspectors classified wooden mortars as unsanitary because the grain absorbs moisture and harbors bacteria, and required stainless steel or food-grade plastic in any licensed kitchen. Cooking classes pushed the garlic press and the knife as cleaner tools. But crushing garlic by impact ruptures more cell walls than slicing does, and that rupture is what releases allicin, the compound responsible for most of garlic's documented health benefits. The pylon hit the balance between maximum release and minimum oxidation, and nobody in the family ever read a research paper about it. Number 20. Soaking dried beans overnight on the counter. In the mainland American kitchen of the 1960s and 70s, canned beans were progress. They were fast, uniform, and safe. Puerto Rican families who still soaked their beans overnight in a bowl on the counter and cooked them for hours the next day were seen as behind the times. The FDA warned that dried beans left at room temperature for extended periods fell into the bacterial danger zone. School cafeterias and institutional kitchens were prohibited from using dried beans that had not been commercially processed. Nutritionists warned about lectins, compounds that can cause digestive distress if beans are undercooked. The warning was real, but the solution was already built into the method. A long overnight soak followed by a slow boil neutralizes virtually all of the lectin content. The families doing it this way were not taking a risk. They were following a process that had already solved the problem centuries before the problem had a name. Slow-cooked beans retain more of their mineral content than canned versions, which lose significant amounts of potassium and magnesium into processing water that gets drained and discarded. The broth in a Puerto Rican bean pot is not waste. It is where the nutrition went. Families served the beans in their liquid, ate the liquid with rice, and consumed what the canning process was throwing out. The overnight soak also begins a mild fermentation that reduces the oligosaccharides responsible for gas. The step that looked like laziness, letting them sit in water all night, was doing the chemical work that made the meal easier to digest. Number 19. Making blood sausage at home. Morcilla, Puerto Rican blood sausage, is made from cooked pork blood mixed with rice, spices, and sofrito, stuffed into natural casings and boiled or grilled. More than 20 states banned the commercial sale of blood-based food products for decades. Health inspectors in mainland cities treated homemade morcilla as a hygiene violation, and the USDA classified blood as a high-risk ingredient subject to federal inspection requirements. Blood spoils quickly. It carries pathogens if mishandled. All of that is true, and all of it was managed by the families who made it. They processed it the same day the animal was slaughtered, boiled it at temperatures that killed every pathogen in question, and ate it within hours. Blood turns out to be one of the most nutrient-dense foods a human being can eat. It is rich in iron, protein, and B vitamins, in forms the body absorbs more efficiently than supplements or fortified cereal. The trick they were told to stop doing was delivering more bioavailable iron per serving than almost anything on the pharmacy shelf. Number 18. Using green bananas as a starch instead of flour or potatoes. The USDA National School Lunch Program did not list plantains or green bananas as approved starch servings for decades. Nutrition guides pushed white flour and white potatoes as standard. Puerto Rican cooks who boiled green bananas and served them as their starch were seen as making do with what they had, a tropical substitute for the real thing. But green bananas are loaded with resistant starch, a carbohydrate that passes through the upper digestive tract without spiking blood sugar. It feeds beneficial gut bacteria in the colon, functions as a prebiotic, and produces short-chain fatty acids that researchers now link to reduced inflammation. The families who served guineos verdes alongside rice and beans were not settling for less. They were adding a prebiotic to the plate decades before the word existed. Number 17. Wrapping food in plantain leaves to cook it. Pastels, the holiday staple of Puerto Rican kitchens, are wrapped in banana or plantain leaves before they are boiled or steamed. Health inspectors in mainland cities cited vendors and church kitchens for using non-approved food contact surfaces. Federal food packaging regulations required that anything wrapping cooked food be classified as food-grade material, and leaves were not on the list. The concern missed what the leaves were actually doing. The waxy surface of a plantain leaf is naturally hydrophobic, creating a sealed steam pocket that cooks the filling evenly while preventing water from diluting the mesa. Compounds in the leaf itself have documented antimicrobial properties. The wrapping was not just a container. It was an active part of the cooking process, and a cleaner one than the plastic wrap that replaced it. There is a pattern forming in this list that goes beyond any single trick. A technique that worked for generations in one culture arrives in a country that does not recognize it. The new country does not test it. It classifies it as a violation. And then, decades later, a laboratory runs the test and discovers that the technique was doing exactly what the families always said it did. The citation was never really about safety. It was about unfamiliarity, dressed up as regulation. Number 16. Fermenting hot peppers in vinegar to make pique. On nearly every Puerto Rican kitchen table sat a glass bottle filled with hot peppers submerged in vinegar, sometimes with garlic cloves and whole peppercorns floating in the brine. State health departments classified homemade fermented condiments as potentially hazardous foods. Selling or distributing pique at community events required a commercial kitchen license in most states, and church fundraisers were cited for offering it without permits. But the acidity of the vinegar drops the pH far below the threshold where dangerous bacteria can survive. The fermentation process that occurs over days and weeks produces lactic acid bacteria, the same probiotics that the wellness industry now sells in capsules for several dollars a bottle. A condiment that cost almost nothing to make was doing what an entire supplement aisle full of products now claims to do. Number 15. Cooking with coconut oil and coconut milk. For most of the 20th century, coconut oil was treated as one of the worst fats a person could eat. It was saturated. It was tropical. It was everything the American Heart Association told the public to avoid. The AHA issued formal advisories against it. Federal nutrition programs removed coconut oil from approved cooking fat lists. School nutrition programs switched to soybean oil and corn oil. Puerto Rican cooks who used coconut milk in their rice, in their desserts, in their bean stews, and as a base for sauces were told they were clogging their arteries with every spoonful. Both replacement oils were heavily processed, and both were high in omega-6 fatty acids that researchers now associate with chronic inflammation when consumed in the quantities the American diet typically delivers. The saturated fat in coconut oil behaves differently from the saturated fat in red meat. A significant portion of it comes in the form of medium-chain triglycerides, which the body metabolizes differently from long-chain fats. Instead of being stored, they are sent directly to the liver and converted into energy. The lauric acid in coconut oil has documented antimicrobial properties that researchers are still cataloging today. The Puerto Rican grandmother who poured coconut milk into her arroz con dulce at Christmas was not making an indulgence. She was using a fat that the entire nutritional establishment spent half a century calling dangerous. The establishment changed its position. She never needed to. Number 14. Marinating meat in bitter orange juice overnight. Naranja agria, the bitter Seville orange, was the backbone of Puerto Rican meat preparation. A pernil soaked overnight in bitter orange juice, garlic, and oregano was not just flavorful. It was safer. But the USDA classified acid marinades as flavoring, not as a food safety step. Official guidelines stated that only temperature could be relied on as a kill step, and overnight room temperature marination violated cold storage rules. The high citric acid content drops the surface pH of raw meat to a level where common pathogens struggle to survive. The combination of acid plus time achieves real antimicrobial work on the meat surface without denaturing the proteins inside. The result is tender meat with a hostile exterior. The families who soaked their pork overnight were running a slow, cold surface treatment with a fruit, and doing it long before anyone wrote a protocol for it. Number 13. Roasting a whole pig over an open fire. The lechon asado, a whole pig roasted slowly on a spit or in a pit, was the centerpiece of Puerto Rican celebrations on the island and in mainland barrios alike. Fire departments issued violations for backyard roasting. Municipal codes in New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia banned open-flame cooking in residential areas. Health departments questioned the safety of cooking over open flame for hours without temperature controls. Neighbors filed complaints. But slow roasting at consistent low temperatures renders the subcutaneous fat gradually, which bastes the meat from the inside. The smoke carries phenolic compounds that act as natural preservatives on the surface of the skin. The longest, slowest, most inconvenient way to cook a pig turns out to produce the cleanest result of any method available. Number 12. Reusing cooking oil across multiple batches. Puerto Rican home cooks did not throw out frying oil after one use. They strained it through cloth, stored it in a jar near the stove, and used it again. Health departments banned oil reuse in commercial kitchens across multiple states, classifying reheated oil as a source of free radicals and carcinogenic compounds. Restaurant inspectors cited kitchens for it, and some of that concern is valid at very high temperatures over many cycles. But careful reuse at moderate frying temperatures, the kind used for tostones and alcapurrias, stays well within safe limits. The oil also picks up flavor compounds from previous batches, building a layered seasoning that no fresh pour can replicate. Professional kitchens call that a well-seasoned fryer. Puerto Rican families just called it the jar by the stove. Number 11. Keeping live chickens in the backyard and slaughtering them at home. In Puerto Rican neighborhoods across the Bronx, Newark, and North Philadelphia, families kept live hens in small coops behind apartment buildings and killed them fresh for Sunday soup and holidays. City zoning ordinances banned backyard poultry in residential areas. The USDA Poultry Products Inspection Act required that any bird sold or distributed for consumption be slaughtered in a federally inspected facility. Health departments confiscated coops and issued fines. But a bird killed and cooked the same morning carries a fraction of the bacterial load of one that traveled through a processing plant, sat on a refrigerated truck, and spent days on a supermarket shelf. The families eating their own birds were not dodging safety. They were shortcutting every point in the supply chain where contamination actually occurs. Number 10. Drying peppers and herbs on the rooftop. On apartment buildings across Spanish Harlem, families spread peppers and herbs on trays in direct sunlight to dry. Building managers reported them. The health department classified rooftop food drying as an open-air contamination risk, and fire codes in New York restricted rooftop obstructions. Inspectors removed trays and issued citations, but ultraviolet light from direct sun exposure kills surface bacteria more effectively than the low-heat dehydrators sold in kitchen stores today. The drying process concentrates the capsaicin in the peppers, which is itself an antimicrobial compound. Dried peppers stored in airtight jars last for months without any preservatives at all. The rooftop was a solar-powered food processor, and the families who used it were preserving their harvest with the most powerful sterilizer available, free of charge. What separates this list from a collection of old recipes is the direction of the proof. These families were not experimenting. They were executing inherited knowledge under economic pressure, in kitchens where money was short and failure meant someone went hungry. The laboratories arrived decades later, with funding and equipment, and confirmed what the pressure of daily survival had already tested and proven on its own. Number 9. Making coquito with raw eggs and no refrigeration. Every December in Puerto Rican households across the mainland, someone made coquito, the coconut and rum drink served at every holiday gathering. The traditional recipe calls for raw egg yolks beaten into the mixture before the rum is added. The FDA classified raw eggs in beverages as a high-risk practice. State health departments banned the sale or distribution of drinks containing raw eggs at public events. The salmonella warnings were posted in every school and clinic serving Puerto Rican neighborhoods. But the alcohol content of the rum acts as a hostile environment for bacteria. The combination of rum, acid from the lime juice that many recipes include, and the emulsification of the egg yolk into the fat of the coconut cream creates conditions that are genuinely inhospitable to the pathogens the warnings targeted. Families who made coquito with raw eggs and let the bottle sit on the counter through the holidays were not gambling. They were relying on a preservation chemistry that the dairy industry uses in a more controlled version to make commercial eggnog. The FDA approved commercial eggnog with pasteurized eggs and alcohol. The Puerto Rican kitchen was doing the same thing with fresher ingredients and stronger rum, and the regulators never made the connection. The bottles passed from house to house through the holidays. The recipe passed from mother to daughter. And the drink that the health department would have pulled from any permitted event was sitting safely on kitchen counters across the Bronx for weeks at a time, protected by the same chemistry the commercial producers paid laboratories to verify. Number 8. Curing and drying meat in open air. In coastal Puerto Rican towns, and later in mainland apartment kitchens, families hung strips of pork and beef in open air to dry, making tasayo, salted dried meat that could last for weeks without refrigeration. The USDA classified any meat dried outside a federally inspected facility as adulterated. Health inspectors in New York and New Jersey seized homemade dried meat from bodegas and church sales. The salt concentration draws moisture below the threshold where bacteria can reproduce, and the surface exposure to moving air creates a rind that seals the interior. Dried meat prepared this way carries less bacterial risk than deli meat sitting in a refrigerated display case because the water activity is too low for pathogens to function. The trick that got confiscated at community fairs was producing a safer product than the packaged one that replaced it. Number 7. Seasoning cast iron with pork fat and never washing it with soap. The caldero, the heavy pot at the center of every Puerto Rican kitchen, was seasoned with manteca and cleaned with coarse salt and a dry cloth. Soap was forbidden. Commercial kitchen health codes required soap and hot water for all cooking surfaces, and inspectors in licensed kitchens issued violations for any pot that had not been washed with detergent. But the polymerized fat layer that builds up on a well-seasoned pot creates a surface that is naturally nonstick and resistant to bacterial adhesion. Soap strips that layer. The salt scrub removes food particles without disturbing the seasoning underneath. The pot that never touched soap was, by every measurable standard, more sanitary than the one that sat in a sink full of detergent. Number 6. Cooking on a wood-burning fogon inside the apartment. Puerto Rican families who came from the island brought the fogon tradition with them, small wood-burning stoves or improvised charcoal setups used to slow-cook beans, roast peppers, and simmer stews. Fire marshals in New York, Philadelphia, and Hartford banned open-flame wood or charcoal cooking inside residential buildings. Carbon monoxide regulations made it illegal. Landlords confiscated the equipment, but the flavor compounds produced by hardwood smoke, the phenolics and guaiacol, are the same compounds that food scientists now inject artificially into commercial barbecue products. The slow, even heat of a wood fire renders collagen in cheap cuts of meat more gently than a gas burner running at its lowest setting. The banned stove was producing better food by every measure except the fire code. Number 5. Collecting and cooking with rainwater. In towns across the island and later on the rooftops of mainland apartment buildings, Puerto Rican families collected rainwater in barrels and buckets and used it for cooking rice, boiling root vegetables, and making coffee. Municipal water authorities classified collected rainwater as non-potable. Several states banned rainwater harvesting outright, and building codes in New York prohibited rooftop collection systems without permits. But filtered rainwater contains none of the chlorine, fluoride, or heavy metals found in municipal tap water. The mineral content is low, which allows the natural flavors of the food to come through without the metallic taste that treated water sometimes carries. The families cooking with collected rain were not risking contamination. They were using the cleanest water available to them. Number 4. Using seawater to cook and season food. In coastal towns across the island, families collected clean seawater and used it to boil root vegetables, season rice, and cook fresh seafood. Mainland health authorities classified ocean water as a contamination risk. State regulations prohibited the use of non-potable water in food preparation, and health inspectors in coastal mainland cities cited restaurants and vendors who used seawater. But clean ocean water from unpolluted coastlines contains a mineral profile that table salt cannot match. Magnesium, potassium, calcium, zinc, and dozens of trace elements in concentrations that the body recognizes and absorbs readily. Families who seasoned their food with the sea were not being careless. They were using the most complete mineral seasoning available and paying nothing for it. Number 3. Curing meat with salt and citrus instead of commercial chemicals. The pernil, the slow-roasted pork shoulder served at holidays and celebrations, was prepared with a wet cure of salt, garlic, oregano, and bitter orange or lime juice. USDA regulations required sodium nitrite in commercially cured meat products. Puerto Rican home cooks who skipped the commercial curing salts and sold or distributed their pernil at church events and block parties were warned they were violating food safety codes. But the combination of salt concentration and citric acid achieves antimicrobial control through a different pathway. The acid lowers the surface pH. The salt draws moisture out of the tissue. Together, they create an environment that inhibits the same pathogens the industrial cure targets, without the compounds that researchers have since raised questions about. The families were not cutting corners. They were taking a different road to the same destination. Number 2. Feeding infants rice water instead of commercial formula. Puerto Rican mothers in public housing projects across New York and New Jersey raised babies on agua de arroz, the starchy water left over after boiling white rice. They strained it, cooled it, and fed it to newborns from a bottle when formula was too expensive or unavailable. Pediatricians and public health nurses in city clinics told them to stop. The official guidance said commercial infant formula was the only safe option, and anything else put the child at risk for malnutrition. Welfare caseworkers flagged families who admitted to the practice. Hospital intake forms asked about it, but the rice water delivered easily digestible carbohydrates and a caloric baseline that kept infants hydrated and growing during the weeks when the welfare check had not arrived and the corner bodega did not stock formula. Generations of Puerto Rican children survived their first months on this, in kitchens where the mother already knew what the nutritional science would later confirm, that simple starches absorbed faster than complex proteins in an underdeveloped digestive system. The authorities said she was doing it wrong. Her baby gained weight anyway. Number 1. Growing herbs and vegetables on the fire escape. On the fire escapes and windowsills of apartment buildings in East Harlem, Williamsburg, and Humboldt Park, Puerto Rican families grew culantro, recao, oregano brujo, and ajíes dulces in old coffee cans and repurposed containers filled with soil they carried upstairs in grocery bags. Landlords told them to stop. City fire codes classified any object on a fire escape as an illegal obstruction. Building inspectors issued violations and confiscated the containers. The herbs that were treated as clutter, harvested fresh and used the same day, contained volatile oil concentrations that dried supermarket herbs cannot approach. Fresh culantro carries antioxidants, aldehydes, and terpenes that degrade rapidly after cutting and vanish almost entirely in the drying process. The oregano brujo grown in those cans is a different species from the Mediterranean oregano sold in jars, with its own distinct compound profile that researchers are studying today for antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties. The families growing food on the fire escape were maintaining a living pharmacy 3 stories above the street, fed with kitchen scraps and harvested through a window that faced the elevated train. Every violation notice that went up on a building door was a notice telling someone to stop growing medicine. The inspectors counted the cans. The families counted the meals those cans seasoned. The scientists came later. The seeds were already in the soil. 25 techniques that were cited, confiscated, and regulated out of kitchens that could not afford to lose them. Not because the techniques failed, but because the people doing them did not have the permits the system required. The kitchens ran the experiments anyway. The labs confirmed it decades later. If any of these tricks were part of your family's table, leave a comment and tell that story. And hit subscribe if you have not already.